right, let's see if we can't get this going. My screen recorder is giving me a little bit of a trouble today. So we're going to be talking about genetics, and a lot of people tend to enjoy this chapter because it's a little bit fun thinking about different characters and how characters are inherited or passed on from one generation to the next. So we're going to start this chapter by talking about an individual by the name of Gregor Mendel. So as you can see, he lived back in the 1800s. So Gregor Mendel was a monk, an Austrian monk who had a nice little garden patch outside of his abbey, and he was interested in crossbreeding plants. And one of the plants that he worked with was garden peas. So garden peas have pretty little flowers to them, and he started crossbreeding them, transferring pollen from one flower to the next, and he started to notice some interesting things about these garden peas. So Gregor Mendel is well known for his garden pea experiments, and we know Mendel as being the father of genetics, kind of starting out this topic of genetics. So we're going to follow one of Mendel's experiments to help explain what goes on in this field of genetics, and we're going to look at what's called a character. So a character is any feature that can be inherited, anything that can be passed on. Now today we know that if something is passed on from one generation to the next, it must be passed on through the DNA, because that's what's passed on in the gametes, the egg cells and the sperm cells, right? If you think back to meiosis, and we talked about having alleles, where these alleles are passed into the daughter cells that are formed. So we're going to look at the character of flower color and how flower color is inherited. So to do this, Gregor Mendel took a pea plant, and here he's got a purple pea flower and a white pea flower, and he's got his little paintbrush, and he's taking it and he's brushing it against the white flower so that it picks up the pollen from the white flower, and then he can transfer it over to the purple flower so that the pollen dusts the stigma on the little purple flower, so it will fertilize the egg cells inside of the purple flowers. Then he takes the seeds that develop afterwards, plants them in the ground, and see which plants pop up and what flower color they have. So you notice he crossed a purple with a white, and he got all purple flowers. At that point, he decided to say, well, this is kind of strange. Why are there no white flowers? Why are they all purple? So he decided to take those purple flowers and pollinate the other purple flowers of that same generation, take the seeds from them, and when he looked at the next generation, he got purple and white flowers. So how did that happen? Because he was really only taking pollen from purple flowers and placing it on more purple flowers. So how did he get white flowers back? So one of the things that Mendel did is he kept very accurate records, and he did this many, many times over and over again. And as you can see below, lots and lots of rows of garden peas as well. So he didn't just do it with 1, 2, 3, 4 plants. We're talking about hundreds of plants that Mendel used. So every time he did these experiments, though, he noticed that one quarter, let's say, of the plants were white and 3/4 of the plants were purple. So how do we explain this appearance of the white flower after skipping a generation? So from Mendel, we can now make some deductions that Mendel didn't quite know about during this time, because once again, he didn't know about DNA and how information was passed on. But today we can trace that character to a gene on the DNA strand. So DNA has hundreds of genes along the length of the DNA strand, And these genes can have slightly different information encoded within them, and that is what we call an allele. So there could be many different alleles that are present in a population for that particular character. So for instance, we said we're going to look at the character of flower color, and we've been looking at white flowers and purple flowers. So those are the alleles. So there's a white allele and there's a purple allele. So it means that the gene for flower color has a different way of coding the information, right? If we go back to transcription and translation, right, how that information is encoded at the level of the DNA as far as that nitrogenous base sequence, whether it was ATCG, GCT, right? That sequence of bases is, once again, how we produce a protein. So it's how we produce that purple pigment. White pigment a lot of times has to do with the lack of pigment. So it could be that there was a mutation at the level of the DNA, and that mutation causes a pigment that, it causes, it's encoded so that it doesn't produce any protein at all. It doesn't produce any pigment at all. So it could be a mutation that has arisen, and that ultimately results in that white allele. All right, so once again, an allele is simply a variation in a gene. So we have white alleles and we have purple alleles. And we know that every organism will inherit 2 alleles for each character. Why 2 alleles? Well, every individual has 2 parents. There's usually a maternal and a paternal allele, right? You inherit 1 allele from mom, 1 allele from dad. So if we look at our example here, we've got an individual that could inherit 2 white alleles, 1 white from mom, 1 white from dad. The individual could inherit 2 purple alleles, 1 purple from mom, 1 purple from dad, or they could have inherited a white from mom and a purple from dad, or vice versa, white from dad, purple from mom. Doesn't matter. They've got 1 white allele and 1 purple allele. So there's different variations that can arise. So we come to Mendel's laws, and we come to Mendel's first law, which is called the law of segregation. So this law basically states that each individual has 2 alleles for a gene. That's what we just talked about. And these alleles separate, or we could say segregate, during the formation of gametes, right? So during the formation of egg cells or sperm cells, and we know that happens by the process of meiosis, so that each gamete receives only 1 allele from each pair. All right, so the law of segregation basically deals with 1 gene at a time and explains how alleles separate during gamete formation. So we've already kind of covered this with meiosis, so we're kind of familiar with this, but it's just kind of repeating as to why we have 2 alleles for, why an individual inherits 2 alleles through the process of fertilization, and that each gamete is only going to have 1 allele. So we give alleles different terms, or we kind of describe them differently. We can describe what we call a dominant allele or a recessive allele. And this has to do when we start combining alleles together. So we had already seen where we could have 2 white alleles combined together, or 2 purple alleles combined together, or a white and a purple allele. So what happens is when we start combining 2 different alleles, we see that only one of those alleles is expressed. So the allele that is expressed when you have two different ones combined together is called the dominant allele. So in this case, we're going to use a capital letter P to represent our dominant allele. So if an individual has two capital letter P's, then they have the two dominant alleles, and they don't really have anything else, right? So therefore, they're going to have a purple flower. The other possibility is they could have the capital P for the dominant allele, and they could have a lowercase p, which we're using to represent our recessive, what we call the recessive allele. So this is the one that is not expressed when it's combined with a dominant allele. So when the dominant is present, the dominant allele is the one that you're going to see. It's the characteristic that you'll be able to see, the trait of that character that you'll see. So therefore, the individual will be purple. The flower will be purple. Now, the way to get a white flower is to exclude the purple allele. So if they have two lowercase p's, in other words, two recessive alleles, they would be white. The flower would be white in color. So what we have just been talking about is what we call the genotype of that character. And we're going to use some terms to describe those allele combinations that we were just talking about. So we use the term homozygous, so that HOMO refers to similar or like, referring to the fact that we have two identical alleles. And we can describe it as being homozygous recessive if there are two recessive alleles that are combined together. Remember, one allele was inherited from the mother, the other allele was inherited from the father. So two alleles that are alike, they're both recessive. This would be considered to be homozygous recessive. Homozygous dominant is when you have two dominant alleles. Once again, we're using the uppercase P, the capital letter P, to refer to our dominant allele. So we would describe them as being homozygous dominant. Their genotype is homozygous dominant. Then our third genotype is what we call heterozygous. Hetero referring to two differences, right? So we have a dominant allele and a recessive allele. So when you have two different alleles combined together, the genotype is called heterozygous. Now, we just mentioned that the genotype refers to the allele combination. We have also what's called the phenotype. Phenotype refers to the physical expression. So think phenotype starts with PH, physical starts with PH. So what does the individual look like? And their phenotype is based on the genotype. The genotype is the allele combination. So here's the genotype again. So this is an individual that is homozygous dominant, two alleles that are exactly the same. Their phenotype would be purple. That's what they look like. So they have two dominant alleles. In this case, the dominant is the purple allele. So they will be purple in color. Here we have the heterozygous genotype. One dominant, one recessive allele. Dominant is purple. The recessive is white. We know when the dominant and the recessive are combined together, the dominant will be expressed, so the phenotype would be purple. Here we have the genotype of homozygous recessive. Two white alleles combined together, the phenotype would be white. Okay, so once again, it says the phenotype depends on the genotype. So you have to look at the genotype in order to determine the phenotype. The phenotype is just what does it look like. So with this terminology, I want to point out the fact that we use the term dominant to describe an allele, but it doesn't mean that the allele